So I'll move on then to samples and sampling. Another big component of electronic music, again, which can be part of your live electronic arsenal. So samplers sort of came from, I suppose, one of the ideas came from using tape loops back in the 50s. A lot of sort of avant-garde composers like Pierre Schaeffer, Pierre Henry used tape loops to create sort of soundscapes that weren't just beyond the sort of typical chamber music or orchestra sounds. And then one of the big sort of developments in technology was a thing called the Mellotron in the 60s, which basically played built-in tape loops within the actual keyboard device itself. It looked like a sort of a washing machine thing there. But each of those sort of racks looking in the front of it, you'd have like a set of strings or a set of tape loops based on flutes or choir sounds. Became very popular sort of late 60s and the 70s as well. There was a big hit sort of prog rock sort of bands and sort of trying to get epical orchestral sounds on having to hire an orchestra. It doesn't sound quite like a real orchestra, but it does have its own particular sound. So I've got some examples that I've built in with again with some samples into a sampler using Mellotron sampler to sort of show you what the sounds of the classic Mellotron is, which again, as it's all within Apple Live, you can easily perform these things off the top. So here's an example of the string sound. This is a classic King Crimson thing from the early 70s. It's a couple of notes, but it has a sort of orchestral sound to it. But again, some of the high notes are a bit artificial and harsh. It sort of works within a certain range. The other big flute sound, the flute sound of the was used famously by the Beatles in Strawberry Fields, which you probably heard this before too. I love to play it. But yeah, the flute sound actually, it's still used by a lot of people. Like I know a lot of sort of pop bands, you hear things like, I know the Chili Peppers use that flute sound a lot on a lot of their tracks. When you hear on the radio and sort of in sort of other fields, let alone just electronic sounds. But yeah, there's sort of a classic set of sounds. The choir sounds were used by Radiohead on OK Computer as well, which have a sort of a strange sort of tonality to them, which is sort of fake but real, sort of that crossover between sampling, where it's sort of on the verge of trying to make it sound like a real thing, but it's not quite, but it has its own sort of character and tone to it. So then sort of leading on from that, samplers, basically sort of leading on from, say, the Mellotron is an idea of using tapes and samples itself. The sample is sort of a modern digital sampler, sort of start with you having multiple recordings or samples of sounds that are playback on based on the instruments configured. Basically, a sample has become quite huge in hip-hop, electronic, avant-garde music. And unlike traditional audio playback, each sample is associated with a synthesis parameter. So instead of just like playing a tape loop, you can be modified basically through a note on the keyboard to play melodies. You know, that's just essentially recording a flute playing one note. But you can, through using a sampler, you can play melodies with that one note, for example. Most have polyphonic capabilities, and you can play more than one note at a time, like chords, etc. Or some are also multi-timbral, when they can play different sounds at the same time, such as in the case of, say, a drum sampler, or even software in a sense, like Ableton Live can be thought of to be as like a sampler in itself, because it does play back multiple samples at the same time. So the basic of samplers, there's two sort of basic ideas behind samplers. There's the phrase sampler, which is like the idea, as I said, for a drum kit. Each keymap, which is like a sound itself in itself, is sort of based on one key, which has a different sample put under it. Sort of like, there's a thing in the sort of late 80s, early 90s came out, so Akai were big in samplers, thing called the Akai MPC, which you can see it had 16 pads on it, which is very similar to like a drum machine in a sense that you could program in drum hits to that, but then you could also use it for other sort of, you know, voice loops or other, like a bass line loop or something as well, so it wasn't just based on being like a drum machine. The next thing was studio samplers, which used what's known as a key mapping system, so you could spread out the sample over a range of keys, like I'm sort of demonstrating with that flute sample from the Mellotron there. This can have slide effects, so some loops speeding up and slowing down the drum loops for the samples. We don't have enough of a range of an instrument. The higher and lower parts might sound unnatural. I'll sort of say a bit more in detail about behind that. With Infinite. Here, I have set up, for example, within this sort of setting here, this is for the flute sound. So I'll just actually I'll minimize this so I can highlight the right control. Within the sampler here, within Ableton Live, the idea behind key mapping is that you should have, there's a sound there, which is the highlighting with the mouse, a range, like a certain note is sort of recorded within a range where it should sound natural, and higher notes are sort of set for each sort of range that they're like a note played high, say on a string, for example, would sound natural within that sort of range of several notes. But if you then try to emulate that low on a low, it would sound very unnatural and sort of mushy sounding. So the idea behind this is that, even though it doesn't really sound very natural as a Mellotron, unfortunately, it should sound more natural in the higher registers. Another example of, I suppose, of samples sounding a bit funny if they're not set up the right way is I have set up a voice recording into the sample here of me talking. And you can sort of hear how the sound speed up and slow down as you go up and down in pitch. So this should be natural sounding, I hope. Oh, it's got delay on it too. It's funky. Analogue. So that's probably a little bit high, but if you go up to here, and you go lower, it's slow motion. So it's sort of a funny novelty effect that if you wanted to just have like a voice sample or something like that, you might just designate that to one key, say on the keyboard, or like a drum pad controller I can have up here on this controller, so it doesn't sound so fake and demented. But yeah, if I do actually add like a note into this sample, for example, it would probably sound a bit more natural. I'll just replace it with this, which is me singing a note, which sounds a bit funny, but you can sort of, because it's a long note too, you can see the waveform there is quite long, you can sort of get away with it as it's a very strange sort of sound. The original recording of that is just me doing this. It's just me singing a high A. But yeah, within the sample, certain sounds work better than others, so depending on what you want to do with it, really. So that's a little bit more about samples there. A little bit of history on samples themselves. So one of the big samples, digital samples that first came out was the Fairlight CMI, or computer musical instrument. It was one of the first sort of polyphonic digital synthesizers, which was actually developed by an Australian company. And the software allowed editing, looping, and mixing and playback via a keyboard, like I've just been doing here. With it had its own built-in computer system and sequencer in a sense. That was about 25 grand back in 1980. So obviously only rich rock stars could afford it. While nowadays you can just get some software and a cheap laptop and a little controller, and you can do the same thing for a few $100 really. But yeah, big users back then were Peter Gabriel, Heavy Hancock, Arthur Noyes, obviously in Yellow, and all those sort of people use a lot of samples in their sounds in sort of the 80s. Used the CMI.